paraphrase, a restatement of a text, passage, or work, giving the meaning in another form. In other words, saying the same thing a different way. Paraphrasing is an approach that we run into sometimes in literature, especially literature that uses archaic or outdated language. This can take the form of so-called translations into modern English, something along the lines of No Fear Shakespeare, where the original text gets replaced by a more modern and understandable wording. And while it is true that parsing out the definitions of archaic vocabulary and getting a clear understanding of a work's structure is a very important first step in reading, there are some dangers on getting hung up on this step, or relying too heavily on these tools. In the mid-20th century, literary critic Cleanth raised this same issue in his landmark essay, The Heresy of Paraphrase. Before we get into that, let's start with a little bit of background. Brooks was part of a movement in literary studies dubbed the New Criticism, whose intention it was to return the focus of literary studies to the work in question, as opposed to the dominant historical biographical focus that was in vogue at the time. After co-authoring 3 extremely influential college textbooks that helped establish New Criticism as the dominant theory at the time, Brooks went on to his most famous work, a collection of essays entitled The Well-Wrought Urn. In it, Brooks traces the English poetic tradition in 10 essays that span from the early Elizabethan era to the modern era, subjecting each of the poems to a close reading and analysis to determine the qualities that make them so timeless and exceptional. In the final and 11th chapter, entitled The Heresy of Paraphrase, Brooks ties all 10 essays together in an effort to identify the commonalities between the poems, and therefore, what makes good poetry so good. This is where our original discussion of paraphrase becomes important. In the essay, Brooks comes to the conclusion that the defining characteristic of the good poem is not its content, but rather its form. It's important to distinguish here for a moment between content and form as Brooks envisions them. For him, content represents the paraphrasable elements of the poem, what it is about in the simplest sense. If we expand this idea to include literature, as Brooks implies is possible, we could say that Hamlet is about a young Danish prince who returns home to avenge his father's death at his uncle's hands. This would be the content of Hamlet. What about the form? Form for Brooks doesn't represent, as it is sometimes used, the formal devices that are used in the work, such as metaphor, rhyme, or structure. Rather, form for Brooks is the organic whole of the work. In another essay, he goes so far as to say that form is meaning. To explain the concept better, I'll turn to the same comparison that Brooks makes in his essay, that of a poem or a work of literature to a piece of music. In music, each note is contextualized by the whole. To give a simple example, once a song is established to be in a specific key, any note played that isn't part of the key is going to sound dissonant. It's not going to fit. However, the same notes played within the context of the key they belong in will harmonize musically with the whole. For Brooks, good literature works on the same terms. Much like music, each word, metaphor, character, or other characteristic of a work is contextualized by the rest of the work, where it all harmonizes with itself in an organic whole. An expression like Hamlet's "to be or not to be" carries tremendous weight in the context of Hamlet's existential meditations on death and the events he's experienced up until the point in the play where these words are uttered, and those words go on to affect things that occur in the rest of the play. Inserted, however, into a different context, where it doesn't belong, it would run the risk of falling flat. As such, good literature becomes invulnerable to paraphrase. By attempting to transmit a work's supposed message without the full context it was meant to reside in, we are losing what Brooks calls the unity of the work and reducing it to a lifeless paraphrase. In Brooks' words, when we ask the question, "What does this poem say?" the only correct answer is this poem says what this poem says. This isn't to say there's no value in analysis or criticism of a literary work. In fact, Brooks himself admits this, especially considering that he's just devoted 300-odd pages to the analysis of 10 different poems. His point is rather that the goal of analysis should not be to convert the work into some other, more palatable form. Rather, it should be to deepen the meaning of the text without losing sight of its centrality. In essence, just as a verbal description of the intricacies of a symphony can help us to appreciate it on a far deeper level without replacing the experience of hearing it, an analysis of a literary work can do the same. It cannot, however, replace the experience of reading the work ourselves. Coming back to our singling out modern English paraphrases and No Fear Shakespeare, there's nothing wrong with reading Shakespeare or any other author in a vocabulary that's more familiar or easier to understand for us. Paraphrases, however, are just tools, designed to help us better appreciate the astounding intricacies and depths of good literature, not replace them.